I cannot count the number of times I've heard the statement, "You're not listening to me." I've heard it from my partner, I've heard it from my friends, I've heard it from my teammates, I've even heard it from my kids. And in all those times, the one thing I always ask myself is, why can't both of us understand each other? If you're watching this video, chances are you've gone through something similar. But I've got good news for you. I read a book. It's called Supercommunicator: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection by Charles Duhigg. And with it, I learned the secret of how to become a good communicator. I'm not perfect yet, but I can tell you that my communication skills have greatly improved. In this video, I'm going to share some of the most important lessons I learned from this book. You might not have noticed this, but within your circle, there are people who everyone seems to love talking to. Someone who always gets promoted or chosen for specific positions. Someone who people love to engage in discussions with. People seem to love to engage in discussions with me, and your response to the last few videos have been awesome. Make sure you guys subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoy this type of video that I'm making for you. If we can get this video to 1,000 likes, I have a special surprise in store for you guys. And comment below which book you'd like me to cover next. But anyway, according to the author, these people are called supercommunicators because they know how to connect with everyone through effective communication. But how can you become one of them? The first thing you need to understand is that every conversation we have with anyone has 3 layers. There are practical decision-making conversations focused on the "what's this really about?" There are emotional conversations that ask, "how do we feel?" And there are social conversations that explore, "who are we?" You see, during conversations with people, we, including those we are talking to, are constantly moving in and out of these layers. According to the author, miscommunication occurs when people are having different kinds of conversations. For example, if you're speaking emotionally and your partner is speaking practically, the conversation will end in frustration. This means that the key to connecting with your partner is to make sure that at every given point in time, you are on the same layer of conversation with your partner. Let me give you an example. Let's say your spouse comes back from work and immediately launches into a tirade about his or her boss. But then you respond with a practical suggestion like, "why don't you invite him over for lunch?" What do you think your spouse's response would be? Probably along the lines of, "you're not listening to me." This is because neither of you is on the same level of conversation. While your partner is on the emotional plane, you are on the practical plane. If you think back to all of your conversations that ended with frustrations, you'll notice that this is the reason why. So what is the solution? According to the author, supercommunicators know how to match other people's layer of conversations by encouraging people to match their own. It sounds complicated, but it's actually easy. But before I explain how you can be a supercommunicator, you need to first understand the 3 layers of communication. Let's start with the first one. What's this really about? The author says that this layer of conversation usually occurs at the beginning of a conversation when we are focused on making choices, plans, or thinking practically. It's why it's also called the decision-making mindset. And according to the author, this layer has 2 goals. 1 is to determine what topics we intend to discuss, and 2, to figure out how the discussion will unfold. In simple terms, you need to first figure out what both you and your partner want out of the discussion, and then how both of you can achieve this together. According to the author, the "what's this really about" conversation is a negotiation, where the goal is not to win, but to help everyone agree on the topics we'll discuss and how we'll make decisions together. So, how can you do this? Simply by asking open-ended questions and paying attention to certain clues during the conversation. When you ask open-ended questions or notice certain clues such as eye contact, a smile, or interruptions, you would be able to grasp what your partner wants to discuss. And then you would be able to figure out how to make the decisions together. So let's say your spouse starts complaining about his or her day. Instead of offering suggestions, simply ask, "do you want me to just listen, or are you asking for advice?" With this question, you will be able to tell what your spouse wants, and both of you will have a smooth conversation. Sometimes your spouse might want to just vent his or her frustrations. This simply tells you that your spouse is in the emotional layer of conversation. The question is, how do you effectively communicate in this layer? This brings me to the next layer of conversation, the "how do we feel" conversation. According to the author, emotions shape every conversation, meaning that in some way, every conversation is a discussion about how we feel. When you're in a conversation with someone, maybe your coworker, your partner, or your child, you hear them express their feelings, either with a statement or their body language. At that point, you are faced with a choice, either to acknowledge that feeling and respond emotionally or ignore it. If you choose to acknowledge it, then that is when the how do we feel conversation starts. Most of the time, however, people tend to ignore their partner's emotions and stick to shallow talks. However, the author says that doing that is the wrong choice. This is because when you acknowledge someone's vulnerability, you become vulnerable in return. This is when you begin to build trust and connections. So how do you effectively communicate in this layer of conversation? According to the author, to discuss emotion effectively, listening is essential. You need to listen for vulnerability, hear what is unsaid, and more importantly, show that you are listening. When you listen actively and people know that you're listening, it will reveal new worlds past the surface of people's words. But to listen effectively, you need to ask the right questions. And by right questions, I mean questions that would make people vulnerable. For example, when you ask someone, "How did you celebrate last Halloween?" the person's response would most likely be unemotional. But when you ask someone, "What do you value most in a friendship?" the person would likely become emotional, spilling last incidents of hurts, betrayals, or expressions of love for friends. When this happens, it's natural that we too become vulnerable, sharing similar experiences with the other person. And this eventually leads us to making connections. So if you're on a date with someone, instead of asking, "Where are you from?" ask, "What do you like about where you live?" Or instead of asking, "What college did you go to?" ask, "What was your favorite part of college?" These questions will certainly make your partner share his or her preferences, beliefs, and values, thereby making them vulnerable. Now, how do you prove that you're listening to your partner? The author says that you can prove that you're listening through a technique called looping for understanding. It's a fairly simple technique that involves 3 processes. 1. Ask a question. 2. Summarize the response you heard from your partner. And 3. Ask if you got it right. This simple process helps to prove to your partner that you are listening, and it will also make you actively listen as well. So to effectively communicate on an emotional layer, you need to ask the right questions and listen effectively. Finally, the third layer of conversation is the who we are conversation. According to the author, in any meaningful conversation, we bring not just ourselves to the discussion, but everything that brought us to this moment. Our histories and backgrounds, our families and friendships, the causes we believe in, and the groups we love or deplore. In simple terms, we bring our social identities into the conversation. Your social identity shapes how you hear and speak. But what is the goal of this layer of conversation? The author says that desire for belonging is at the core of who we are conversations. And this conversation occurs when we talk about our connection to society. When we engage in discussions with people with similar or overlapping social identities, it's easy for us to connect and engage in meaningful conversations. But the reverse is the case when we meet people with different social identities. So how do you engage in meaningful conversations with people with different social identities? According to the author, there are 3 things you have to do. 1. Make them understand that we all have multiple social identities. Secondly, everyone should be on equal footing. And finally, look for social similarities. If you can build new social identities with people, you can successfully build connections with them. Overall, to be a super communicator, you need to understand what layer of conversation you're having with someone and ensure you respond in kind.